so much. You were under time. So discussants, you all have 15 minutes between the two of you to really weigh in. And I'm so happy to introduce our two discussants. I think that these are two examples of that next generation of evidence-based practice researchers that Dr. McKay referred to. We have Dr. Jennifer Bellamy, who's at the University of Chicago. And her work focuses on evidence-based practice, engagement, and especially around engaging fathers. I think a theme across our presenters today is that focus on engagement, and really it's something I care about a lot in my own work as well, so I'm really pleased to see that. And then we also have Dr. Sarah Betsy Bledsoe-Mansouri. She is an assistant professor at the School of Social Work at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and her work also is on evidence-based practice and engagement. So I'll turn it over to you all.
All right. Well, thanks, everyone. So we have to warn you a little bit because Betsy and I have known each other since we entered our doctoral program. And we share a mentor in common, as well as several funded research studies and papers. And although we went to our respective corners to sort of read Dr. McKay's work, and separately came together with notes, we figured out we had a whole lot of overlap.
Tends to happen.
So we're going to bounce back and forth a little bit. I hope that's okay. So you get the Jen and Betsy show. So bear with us. So I was going to start with just a couple of broad themes that are sort of emerging for me from this paper, but also from the discussions that we've had so far in other papers and work. One is that it seems like a lot of the most exciting stuff coming out around evidence-based practice right now is around this idea of flexibly responding to variation across client systems, across service contexts, and how all of those things sort of fit together, whether we're trying to fit them together from the ground up from work like we were just describing right now, or whether we're trying to think about first generation interventions, I really like that, and adaptation. And I'm wondering how, I think there are real leaders and thinkers and inspiring folks working around cultural adaptation, and there are a lot of theories and frameworks coming out of there. But I wonder if we can shift some of that more to the center of the discussion, not just specific to racial, ethnic, cultural adaptation, but adaptation around these intersecting identities and issues for client systems, but also for service contexts. And I think we already had some more excited from Castro and Correa related to reasons to adapt would be evidence that we're seeing poor engagement or poor outcomes, but also poor uptake in real service systems. So congratulations for those of us who are working to create successful interventions that are engaging and have good outcomes, but if nobody's using them, not so helpful. So that was one thing. The other theme that really jumped out at me was the need to sort of pull back the lid on or open up the black box of interventions more deeply, looking at moderators, and even for those gold standard interventions where outcomes look great, there's a large portion of the folks who were recruited for those studies that did not benefit or benefited to a disappointing level. So what's going on with them? And I think I get excited by work where we can really break the results of these RCTs down into subgroups and take a look at. And that was something that was very exciting to me about your paper.
Yeah, and I think Jennifer's touched on, as we mentioned earlier, many of the things that stood out to me as I was reading Mary and her colleagues' paper and also watching the presentation. First of all, I just want to thank you, Mary, and your colleagues for giving an excellent example of an evidence or an emerging, wherever we are in the degree of evidence, an intervention that really does pull on all three areas of evidence-based practice. I see so many folks developing interventions based only on the empirical literature evidence, whereas we see that these types of outcomes are attainable, and I would credit much of that to the fact that Mary and her team have not only pulled on the empirical evidence, obviously, but have also involved the clients in their perspectives, have involved their own clinical knowledge and the clinical knowledge of the practitioners that are working with these very vulnerable youth. And I think that that's an amazing part of this research and something we can all aspire to. And the strengths of the 4 R's and the 2 S's, I believe, is in part that it was really developed from the ground up for this population. And I think the challenge for many of us is that this is a long, long line of work that Mary alluded to starting way back in Chicago. And so what do we do in the meantime? So of course, as Jennifer mentioned, there is this option to adapt existing interventions that we know may be helpful for certain clients in certain contexts. And I am in complete agreement with Jennifer, was looking as I was reading this paper at work by Castro, and she'll do the pronunciations much better than I will, but Ferreira, and some of the questions that Flavio Rosiclia alluded to earlier. When do we adapt, and when do we try things as they are? And then going through some of the cultural adaptation strategies, it seems to me that many of these strategies could be translated into also looking at clients who are simply living in very difficult environments, looking at clients who have complex comorbidity and complex service needs. And one of the challenges that I've seen in my own work, which started more with specific cultural adaptation, is that unfortunately service providers to the most vulnerable populations that I'm interested in working with, whose demographics look very similar to the families that Mary has put up there, they don't have a Latina clinic that the pregnant, depressed adolescents go to. They don't have a, African American clinic. And so I think the challenge is to really try to develop services that incorporate the ability to be culturally acceptable while not being culturally specific.
So another thing that I was thinking about as Betsy was talking is that this sort of conversation around adaptation evidence. What is the evidence of the need to adapt? And in my work, and I'm, as Sarah mentioned, interested in engaging fathers in services that are traditionally not well attended by men. Or training, visiting. These are very promising and exciting interventions, but they have a terrible track record with engaging fathers, and when fathers do engage, they tend to not benefit to the same degree as mothers do. So I'm framing this as an adaptation problem, and so I'm doing my homework. I'm looking at what other people have learned about fathers in terms of how do we adapt interventions to better engage them. And let me tell you, there is a boatload of literature starting like in the late 60s, early 70s around exactly this type of topic. And the empirical evidence for what actually works is like zilch. There is what I'd like to, I'm going to coin a new term. Are you ready? Adaptation legends. There are legends about what fathers need in terms of their engagement, recruitment, retention, and benefit in historically mother and child serving systems. Child welfare is chock full of these kind of things as well. And there are things like, if you make it about sports, men will come. Or, we just need to stop painting our waiting rooms pink and showing pictures of breasts and asking men about when their last menstruation was, and then they'll come. There are lots of ideas, both at the surface level of adaptation, right? So those like painting the waiting room color or whatever, surface adaptation for sure, and more deep level ideas about, well, men as parents, they're really the disciplinarian. This is kind of hilarious in my current. Mary mentioned I have two 10-month-old twins at home, so my better half and I are figuring this stuff out. But thinking about these these messages that we have around how do you engage culturally diverse families, how do you engage men or women, depending on the question that we're asking. There's a whole lot of thought, theory, conversation, and a lot of citation of the same messages over and over again, but actually the evidence base is pretty scant in terms of what we can do across interventions to engage populations that have not been well served or well included in research or services, really.
Which actually brings me back to another theme that emerged for me as I was reading Mary's paper